Nathaniel Carter had spent his life building an empire, brick by calculated brick. From the moment he took control of his first failing investment firm, he had never once allowed emotion to dictate his choices. Everything he did was measured, precise, built for maximum efficiency and gain. Now, at 45, he stood at the pinnacle of success, a man revered in the financial world, feared by competitors, and admired by those who sought to emulate his ruthless ambition. Yet for all his wealth, power, and influence, an uncomfortable truth loomed over him. He had no heir. It wasn't for lack of trying. He had been married twice, both unions ending in failure, not because of infidelity or scandal, but because Nathaniel was incapable of love in the way his wives had expected. Relationships were a distraction. Marriage was a liability. He had believed that partnerships, like businesses, could be negotiated, managed, and controlled, but emotions had proved to be unpredictable, and he did not tolerate uncertainty in his life. That was why this time he would handle things differently. Nathaniel didn't want a family. He wanted a successor, someone to inherit his empire, to carry on his name. A child was an investment, a calculated step toward ensuring his legacy. But this time, there would be no complications, no emotional entanglements, no chance of betrayal. He would find a woman willing to bear his child under strict legal agreements. She would receive compensation, medical care, and everything necessary to ensure a smooth pregnancy. And when the child was born, she would walk away. It would be a clean, emotionless transaction, just another business deal. As he drove through the streets of the city that night, the thought lingered in his mind. He knew he could go through an agency, hire a surrogate from a list of carefully vetted candidates. It would be the logical choice. But logic didn't always equate to control. He wanted someone with no ties, no leverage over him, someone who wouldn't change their mind. That was when he saw her. At a red light, his eyes fell upon a lone figure sitting on the sidewalk, cross-legged on the pavement, completely absorbed in what she was doing. In her hands, she held a piece of cardboard, its edges frayed from wear. She moved a dull pencil across the surface, sketching with an intensity that made the world around her disappear. Nathaniel might have ignored her if not for the way she carried herself. Most people in her position avoided eye contact, their shoulders hunched from the weight of hardship. But this woman, there was something almost serene about her focus, as if she had carved out a world of her own amidst the chaos of the city. She was young, mid-20s perhaps. Her brown hair fell in messy waves over her shoulders, tangled but not unkempt. Her face, though worn with exhaustion, still held an undeniable beauty. But it was her eyes that made him hesitate. Even from a distance, they were striking, sharp and watchful, an icy shade of blue that seemed to cut through the darkness of the night. The light turned green. Nathaniel forced himself to look away, pressing his foot on the accelerator. It wasn't his concern. He wasn't a man who let strangers disrupt his carefully structured world. And yet, as he drove past the city's glittering skyline, he found his thoughts circling back to her. Something about her had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't pity. He had no room for sentimentality. No, it was something else. Control. She had nothing, Yet she didn't look defeated. She sat there as if the world could collapse around her, and she wouldn't flinch. There was strength in that, a resilience he didn't often see. Without fully understanding why, Nathaniel pulled into a parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as irritation flared in his chest. He didn't do this. He didn't make impulsive choices. And yet, against every instinct screaming at him to move on, he turned the car around. Minutes later, he pulled up to the curb where she sat. Rolling down the window, he spoke in a firm, commanding tone. "You! Come here!" The woman looked up slowly, her gaze unreadable. She didn't scramble to her feet or rush to obey. Instead, she studied him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I'm not looking for charity," she said, her voice even, unaffected. Nathaniel smirked. "Good, because I'm not offering any." She said nothing, but he could see her mind working, assessing whether he was a threat, a scammer, or something worse. "I have a business proposition," he continued. "Get in." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You always offer business deals to strangers on the street?" "No, but I don't have all night to stand here convincing you either. You want to hear what I have to say? Get in the car." For a moment, she seemed to consider rejecting him outright. Then, with a quiet sigh, she stood, dusting off her worn jeans. "If you try anything, I'll make you regret it," she muttered, before climbing into the passenger seat. Nathaniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he pulled the car away from the curb. "Somehow," he said, glancing at her, "I don't doubt that." As they drove through the city streets, the silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. He had expected someone more desperate, someone eager to accept whatever offer he dangled in front of them. Instead, she was wary, guarded. He liked that. Finally, he spoke. "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering. "Scarlett Hayes." "Scarlett," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Tell me, Scarlett, how does someone like you end up on the street?" Her jaw tightened. "I don't owe you my life story." "No, you don't," he admitted, "but I need to know who I'm dealing with." She crossed her arms, her blue eyes flickering toward the city skyline. "Life happens. One bad decision leads to another, and before you know it, you're sleeping on the pavement." There was bitterness in her tone, but no self-pity, just cold, hard acceptance. Nathaniel nodded, as if that answer was enough. "All right," he said, "then let me make you an offer, one that will change your life." Scarlett turned to him, skeptical. "I doubt that." He met her gaze without hesitation. "I want you to have my child." For a split second, she looked genuinely stunned. Then she let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Yeah, okay, you're insane." "I'm serious." Scarlett shook her head, rubbing her temples. "So, let me get this straight. Some rich guy I've never met before wants me to have his kid? You expect me to believe this isn't some twisted game?" "I don't play games, Scarlett." His voice was steady, unwavering. "This is a contract. You'll be provided for throughout the pregnancy. When the child is born, you walk away with enough money to start over. No strings attached." Scarlett fell silent, absorbing his words. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. "You have nothing. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to rebuild your life on your terms. Or you can walk away and go back to starving on the streets." She swallowed hard, gripping her hands together. He could see the war inside her, the conflict between pride and survival. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "You're insane," she repeated, shaking her head. But she didn't say no. Scarlett sat stiffly in the leather seat of Nathaniel's car, her mind racing through every possible scenario. What kind of man made an offer like this? Was he a lunatic? A trafficker? Some billionaire with a god complex? Nothing about the situation made sense, and yet she hadn't gotten out of the car. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the quiet, terrifying truth that she had nothing left to lose. Nathaniel, for his part, drove in silence, his grip steady on the wheel. He was used to making deals, sealing contracts, manipulating numbers and assets to ensure maximum profit. But Scarlett wasn't a number, and she wasn't an easy negotiation. That much was obvious. She sat next to him with her arms crossed, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she were still considering an escape. "You're tense," Nathaniel observed, his voice as calm and even as ever. Scarlett scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, really? You think?" His lips curved slightly, more of an acknowledgement than a smile. "I assume you have questions." "Yeah," she snapped. "Like, what the hell is wrong with you?" Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, unbothered by her sharp tone. "Nothing. I simply know what I want." "And that's a kid?" She turned to look at him, eyes narrowed. "You think you can just buy one like a new car?" "No," he replied smoothly. "A car depreciates in value. A child, however, is an investment." Scarlett let out a bitter laugh. "Jesus, you sound like you're hiring an intern." "I'm hiring a surrogate." Scarlett flinched at the word, the coldness of it slicing through her. "So that's all I am to you? A walking womb?" Nathaniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You are a woman in need of an opportunity. I am a man in need of an heir. This is a mutually beneficial agreement." She shook her head in disbelief. "You're insane. And yet, you're still here." That shut her up, because he was right. She hadn't bolted, hadn't told him to go to hell, because deep down, beyond her anger, there was something else, a gnawing hunger for survival. The streets had worn her down, chipped away at her pride, her energy, her hope. She had once believed in fighting for herself, for her dreams. But hunger had a way of dulling ambition, and at some point, surviving the night had become more important than dreaming about tomorrow. The car slowed to a stop in front of an upscale restaurant, its glass windows reflecting the city lights. Nathaniel stepped out first, handing the keys to the valet before opening her door. Scarlett hesitated before getting out, her worn sneakers feeling out of place on the polished pavement. "You really think I belong here?" she muttered, looking up at the grand entrance. Nathaniel studied her for a moment before replying, "You belong wherever you decide to be." She hated that answer, mostly because it sounded like something a rich man with too many choices would say. But she followed him inside anyway. The hostess barely blinked at her appearance, no doubt trained to cater to men like Nathaniel, who often brought in guests who didn't quite fit the mold. Within minutes, they were seated in a private booth, the dim lighting casting soft shadows across Nathaniel's sharp features. Scarlett eyed the menu warily. The prices alone made her stomach turn. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, but the idea of accepting something from this man, something she hadn't earned, made her uneasy. Nathaniel, sensing her hesitation, spoke without looking up from his menu. "Order whatever you want. This isn't a test. Everything with you feels like a test." she muttered. He looked up then, his gaze steady. That's because you're waiting for a catch. She met his stare, refusing to flinch. There's always a catch. The waiter arrived before Nathaniel could respond, and Scarlett ordered something simple, something that wouldn't make her feel like she owed him more than she already did. When they were alone again, Nathaniel leaned back, assessing her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. I understand your hesitation, he said finally. It's logical, but I don't deal in deception, Scarlett. I deal in contracts. If you agree to this, everything will be written, signed, and legally binding. You'll have full medical care, a safe place to live, and when the child is born, you'll leave with enough money to start over. Scarlett gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. And then what? You just take the kid and pretend I never existed? Yes. His answer was so blunt, so absolute, that it knocked the air from her lungs. Scarlett forced a smirk, masking the sting of his words. You really don't care about people, do you? Nathaniel didn't flinch. I care about results. She exhaled sharply, looking away. She shouldn't have expected anything else. Men like him didn't have hearts. They had ledgers, balance sheets, plans that didn't include room for human error. And what if I say no? She challenged. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink before answering. Then you go back to the streets, back to hunger, back to uncertainty. He set the glass down with precision. You think this is about morality, Scarlett. It's not. It's about survival, yours and mine. Scarlett's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him to go to hell, to stand up and walk out of this overpriced restaurant and prove that she wasn't some desperate stray willing to sell herself for security. But the truth was, she was desperate, and she was tired. Still, she needed to know one thing. Why me? She asked, her voice quieter now. You could go to a clinic, find some rich socialite who'd jump at the chance to have your perfect heir. So why pick someone like me? Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before replying. Because you have nothing to lose. The words hit harder than she expected. Because they were true. Scarlett looked down at the linen napkin in her lap, her mind warring with itself. She knew what this was. A deal, a transaction, and yet something about it felt bigger than that, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. Could she do this? Could she bring a child into the world knowing she'd have to walk away? Nathaniel, ever the businessman, seemed to sense her turmoil. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope, sliding it across the table. Take this, he said. Scarlett eyed it suspiciously, but picked it up. Inside was a check. Enough to change everything. Enough to rent an apartment, get food, find a job, start over. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This is yours, whether you accept or not, Nathaniel said simply. A gesture of good faith. Scarlett swallowed hard. This was it. The choice that would define everything. She lifted her gaze to his, searching for something, anything, that would make this decision easier. But Nathaniel Carter remained a fortress, unreadable and unwavering. And so, with her heart pounding in her chest, Scarlett inhaled deeply and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Scarlett had never signed a contract before, at least not one that felt so permanent. Her name had graced arrest records, shelter intake forms, the occasional short-lived employment agreement, but never anything that felt like it had the power to rewrite her entire future. And yet, Here she was, sitting in an office that smelled like wealth, staring down at a piece of paper that would bind her to Nathaniel Carter in a way she wasn't sure she could ever fully comprehend. The pen felt heavy in her fingers as she hesitated over the final line, her signature, the last piece needed to cement this deal into reality. Across from her, Nathaniel sat with the same unreadable expression he always wore, calm, controlled, as if this were nothing more than another business transaction. And to him, maybe that's all it was. "You're hesitating," he observed, his voice steady, devoid of concern. Scarlett clenched her jaw. "Yeah, well, forgive me if I need a second before signing my body over to a complete stranger." "You're not signing your body over," he corrected. "You're signing an agreement, one that benefits you." She exhaled sharply, dropping the pen onto the desk. "Easy for you to say. You get exactly what you want. A kid, an heir. Meanwhile, I get to spend the next 9 months growing a person inside me, then hand them over and pretend it never happened." Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced as he studied her. "You knew what this was when you agreed to meet with me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You had time to walk away?" Scarlett scoffed, shaking her head. "I had time. What time? You put a check in front of me, and suddenly, for the first time in years, I could actually breathe. I could eat without counting every dollar. I could sleep in a bed instead of hoping it doesn't rain while I'm under a bridge. Do you really think I had a choice?" Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze, something close to understanding, though she doubted he'd ever admit it. He was a man who had never known hunger, who had never felt the kind of desperation that gnawed at a person's ribs until they had no choice but to make deals with the devil. "You always have a choice," he said simply. "You're here because you chose to be." Scarlett swallowed, her throat tight with frustration. He was right, in the most infuriating way. She had chosen this. No one had forced her into his car that night. No one had made her accept his invitation to dinner, to the hotel suite, where he laid out every detail of his proposal with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling the outcomes of every situation. And no one had stopped her from following him into this office, from reading over the contract that spelled out every expectation, every legal safeguard, every dollar she would receive in exchange for carrying his child. She had chosen this. So why did it still feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, seconds away from free-falling into the unknown? Nathaniel didn't push. He sat back, waiting, as if he knew she needed to come to the decision on her own. It infuriated her how patient he could be, how unaffected he seemed by the weight of what they were about to do. "After the baby is born?" she asked quietly, running a finger along the smooth edge of the paper. "You'll really just take them and never let me see them again?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, the first real crack in his composure. That was the agreement. Scarlett nodded slowly, absorbing the finality of those words. The rational part of her told her this was for the best. She had never wanted to be a mother. Hell, she barely knew how to take care of herself. A child raised by her would only suffer the same cycles of poverty and instability she had endured. With Nathaniel, they would have everything: wealth, education, security. She should be relieved. But there was something about the way he said it, the way he referred to their child as nothing more than an agreement, That made her stomach twist. "And what if I change my mind?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel didn't blink. "You won't." Scarlett let out a humorless laugh. "God, you're arrogant." "I'm realistic," he corrected. "You accepted this knowing the terms. This isn't about feelings, Scarlett. It's about ensuring the future of my legacy." Scarlett studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the armor he so carefully maintained. But there was none. Nathaniel Carter was a man of certainty. He did not make impulsive choices. He did not leave room for emotion. She wondered what it must be like to live that way, to move through life with such unwavering control, to never let fear or doubt dictate a single decision. With a deep breath, Scarlett picked up the pen again, her fingers trembling only slightly as she lowered it to the paper. This was it. One signature, and she would no longer be just another nameless woman on the street. She would be something else entirely. A piece of a deal, a means to an end. A person who would one day look back on this moment and wonder if she had sold away something more than just her body, her future, her child, her soul. But she had made her choice. With a final exhale, she signed her name. Nathaniel took the contract and slid it into a folder without ceremony, as if it were no different from any other deal he had brokered. When he finally met her gaze again, his expression remained unreadable. "I'll have my assistant make the arrangements," he said. "You'll be moved into a private residence where your medical care and expenses will be fully covered. I'll check in periodically, but for the most part, you'll be left alone." Scarlett raised an eyebrow. "So what? You're just going to hand me off to some doctors and forget I exist until the kid shows up?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Something like that." She hated how much that stung. Pushing back her chair, Scarlett stood, suddenly needing to get out of that office, out of the suffocating weight of what she had just done. Nathaniel watched her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Scarlett," he said before she reached the door. She paused, waiting. "You made the right decision?" She turned to look at him then, and for the first time, she let him see just how much she hated him in that moment. Not because he was wrong, but because he might be right. Without another word, she walked out, her footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. Nathaniel remained at his desk, staring at the contract she had just signed. It should have felt like a victory. So why did it feel like something else entirely? Scarlett had never lived in luxury before. She had passed by expensive restaurants, watched from a distance as people in tailored suits and designer dresses walked into buildings that seemed unreachable, like castles in a world she would never belong to. Now, she stood in the doorway of a penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, her fingers gripping the strap of the only bag she owned. The space was immaculate, modern, and impersonal, just like the man who had put her here. Nathaniel had not come with her. Instead, his assistant, Evelyn, had been the one to escort her from his office to this place, explaining every detail in a professional, detached tone. Scarlett had barely listened. She was still reeling from the contract, from the finality of the decision she had made. It had been hours since she'd signed her name, and already she felt something inside her shifting, something she couldn't quite define. Evelyn gave her one last glance before turning to leave. "If you need anything, there's a direct line to my office in the study. You'll have a driver available for appointments, but for now, I'd suggest you settle in. Mr. Carter will check in when necessary." Scarlett didn't respond. She waited until the door clicked shut before exhaling, her shoulders slumping under the weight of exhaustion. She was alone. The penthouse was beautiful, if cold. Expansive windows lined the walls, offering a breathtaking view of the city below. Everything was sleek: polished marble, dark wood, furniture that looked expensive and untouched. It felt like a hotel, a place meant for temporary stays, not a home. She wandered through the space, running her fingers along the edges of the kitchen counters, the back of a velvet chair. It was strange, being somewhere so quiet, so empty. She made her way to the bedroom, where a massive bed dominated the space, its crisp, white sheets looking like they had never been disturbed. She sat down cautiously, half expecting someone to tell her she didn't belong here. But there was no one, just silence. For years, Scarlett had spent her nights in shelters, in abandoned buildings, on park benches where sleep came in restless, fleeting moments. The idea of closing her eyes in a place where no one could steal from her, where she didn't have to keep one hand on her belongings, was almost incomprehensible. But comfort was a dangerous thing. She knew better than to trust it. Lying back, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying everything that had led her here. The contract, the way Nathaniel had barely reacted when she signed it, as if she had done exactly what he expected. The way he had told her she had made the right decision, his voice devoid of warmth or reassurance. She had made the right decision, hadn't she? Scarlett pressed a hand against her stomach, though she knew there was nothing there yet. It didn't feel real. Not the pregnancy, not the money, not the strange arrangement she had walked into with a man who saw children as investments rather than people. But it was real. And now, it was hers to live with. The next morning, she woke to the sound of the city humming outside the window. For the first time in years, she had slept through the night without waking in panic. The realization unsettled her more than it comforted her. A knock at the door startled her, and she hesitated before answering. When she did, a woman in a crisp uniform stood on the other side, pushing a cart filled with food. "Breakfast, ma'am," the woman said, her tone polite but formal. Scarlett frowned. "I didn't order anything." "It's part of your arrangement. Mr. Carter has instructed that you receive full accommodations." Scarlett's stomach twisted at the mention of his name. She stepped aside reluctantly, letting the woman wheel the cart into the room, before leaving without another word. The food looked incredible. Fresh fruit, eggs cooked to perfection, pastries arranged neatly on delicate china. It was the kind of meal she had only ever seen through restaurant windows. And for a long moment, she just stared at it. Then hunger won. She ate in silence, each bite a reminder of just how long she had gone without something so simple. It felt wrong, in a way, to be sitting here in a silk robe that had been left for her, eating food prepared by someone else, knowing that just days ago she had been curled up on a cold sidewalk. After breakfast, she explored more of the penthouse, opening doors that led to rooms she had no idea how to fill. A library lined with shelves of books she had never heard of. A balcony with a view that made her feel both small and untouchable. A bathroom larger than the last apartment she had rented before losing everything. She ended up in the study, where a single file sat on the desk with her name printed on the cover. Scarlett Hayes. Inside, she found paperwork detailing every aspect of her medical care, as well as a structured schedule outlining prenatal visits, dietary requirements, and fitness recommendations. It was efficient, thorough, and impersonal, just like Nathaniel. She closed the file and sat back in the chair, rubbing her temples. What had she done? Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found herself standing by the window, staring at the city lights. This should have felt like freedom, but it didn't. It felt like she had traded one kind of cage for another. Her phone, one she had been given upon arrival, buzzed on the table. She hesitated before picking it up. Nathaniel's name flashed across the screen. She answered, holding the phone to her ear. "Settling in?" His voice was as composed as ever, as if this were a routine check-in, not a conversation about the life they had just agreed to bring into the world. Scarlett exhaled slowly. "I guess." "Good, you have your first appointment tomorrow. My driver will take you." She bristled at the command in his tone. "You don't have to micromanage me, you know. I'm not one of your employees." There was a pause. Then, "No, but you are part of an agreement, and I expect you to follow through on your end." Scarlett clenched her jaw, gripping the phone tighter. "You really don't see anything wrong with this, do you?" "What exactly do you want me to say?" Nathaniel asked, his voice unwavering. "That I regret offering you a way out? That I should have chosen someone else?" Scarlett let out a bitter laugh. "You act like you're doing me some huge favor. You agreed to this," he reminded her. "No one forced you." She hated how easily he could throw her own choices back at her, how he could make everything sound so calculated, so devoid of emotion. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved. "Just be ready tomorrow," Nathaniel said finally. His tone clipped. The call ended before she could say anything else. Scarlett set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment before looking back out at the city. For the first time since signing the contract, she felt it, the weight of what she had agreed to, the reality of what was coming. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready. Scarlett sat in the back of the sleek black car, her fingers pressed against the smooth leather seat as the city blurred past her. It still didn't feel real. The penthouse, the personal driver, the food delivered to her door. It was all so far removed from the life she had known that she almost felt like an imposter. But the weight of the contract in the back of her mind reminded her that this wasn't some fairy tale where a lost girl stumbled into a fortune. This was a deal, and every comfort came with a cost. The car pulled to a smooth stop in front of a private medical building, a place that looked more like a luxury hotel than a clinic. Scarlett hesitated before stepping out, adjusting the sleeves of the sweater she had been given, the fabric softer than anything she had ever owned. It made her feel uncomfortable, like she was playing a role she hadn't rehearsed for. Inside, the reception area was pristine, all glass and polished marble, the air carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus. A woman in a crisp white coat greeted her with a polite smile, leading her down a hallway lined with framed certificates and awards. The walls were painted in calming shades of blue and gray, designed to put patients at ease, but Scarlett's nerves only tightened. Dr. Evelyn Harper was nothing like she had expected. Instead of an older, distant professional. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth. She glanced over Scarlett's file, scanning the paperwork with quick efficiency before setting it aside and folding her hands on the desk. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone light but observant. Scarlett shifted in her seat. "Fine, I guess. Any nausea? Fatigue?" "A little tired, but nothing crazy, doctor." Harper nodded, scribbling a note before looking up again. "I know this is an unusual situation. Mr. Carter has ensured that you'll have access to the best medical care, but I want to make sure that you feel comfortable through this process, not just physically, but emotionally as well." Scarlett let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Comfortable? You mean with carrying a child I'm supposed to pretend doesn't exist after it's born?" The doctor's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "I'm here as your physician, not as part of any contract. My priority is your well-being." Scarlett looked away, staring at the framed photograph on the doctor's desk. Two young children playing by the ocean. It felt strange, sitting here discussing a life growing inside her, while knowing she would never see the child take their first steps or hear their first laugh. It was better this way, she told herself. The baby would have a life of privilege, raised by a man who could give them everything. She had nothing to offer. "Let's do the first ultrasound," Dr. Harper said gently, standing, "just to check on everything." Scarlett followed her into the exam room, feeling the cold weight of reality settle over her. This was happening. It wasn't just ink on a contract or an abstract idea. There was life inside her, growing, changing, becoming something real. The gel was cold against her skin, and she flinched slightly before forcing herself to stay still. Dr. Harper moved the probe carefully, her eyes scanning the screen as soft static filled the room. Then a sound, faint but steady, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that sent a strange foreign sensation through Scarlett's chest. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Is that?" Dr. Harper smiled. "That's the baby's heartbeat." Scarlett hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she let it out in a shaky exhale. The sound was mesmerizing, more real than anything she had allowed herself to feel. She had spent so long seeing this pregnancy as a transaction, a means to an end, that she hadn't stopped to consider what it would actually mean to carry life inside her. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said, adjusting the screen so Scarlett could see more clearly. "You're about 8 weeks along. Strong heartbeat, good growth." Scarlett stared at the grainy image on the screen, a tiny shape barely distinguishable, but undeniably there. She had spent years feeling invisible, like she didn't belong anywhere. But this small, growing life belonged to her, even if only for a while. Dr. Harper's voice was softer now. "It's a lot to process, isn't it?" Scarlett nodded, unable to find the words. After the appointment, she was escorted back to the car, the city feeling different now, sharper, louder. The weight in her chest hadn't gone away. It followed her up the elevator to the penthouse, lingered as she sat by the window, staring out at the skyline. She could still hear the heartbeat, feel the remnants of something shifting inside her, something she hadn't anticipated. The phone buzzed beside her. Nathaniel. She let it ring twice before answering. "How was the appointment?" His voice was the same, measured, controlled, as if he were asking about a business report. Scarlett closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the windowsill. Fine. There was a brief pause. Dr. Harper said everything looks good? Yeah. Another pause. Scarlett. She opened her eyes, staring at her reflection in the glass. What? Did you hear the heartbeat? Her grip tightened. He hadn't asked if she'd seen the scan, hadn't asked about medical details. He had asked about the heartbeat. She hesitated before answering. Yes. Silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Good, Nathaniel said finally. I'll check in later. The call ended, leaving Scarlett alone with the lingering echo of something unspoken. She didn't know what unsettled her more, that he had asked about it, or that he had waited for her answer. Scarlett had always thought of silence as something empty, something that stretched between people when there was nothing left to say. But the silence between her and Nathaniel was different. It wasn't hollow. It was heavy, weighted with things unsaid, with the quiet shift in her world that neither of them had fully acknowledged. She had spent the night replaying the sound of the baby's heartbeat in her mind, feeling it echo through her even after the clinic visit had ended. It unsettled her, the way it lingered, the way it refused to be ignored. She had expected to feel indifferent. Instead, something had cracked open inside her, something she wasn't ready to face. The next morning, she woke up later than usual, sunlight pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. She stretched out across the bed, her body aching in a way she hadn't noticed before. She had read somewhere once that pregnancy changed everything, even in the early stages. She hadn't believed it then. She was starting to now. She made her way to the kitchen, finding the fridge stocked with fresh fruit, organic juices, meals that had been prepped and labeled with times she was supposed to eat. Nathaniel had planned everything down to the last detail, ensuring that she had what she needed without ever asking her what she wanted. She grabbed an apple, biting into it as she wandered toward the living room, where a set of books had been placed on the glass coffee table. She hadn't noticed them before. Curious, she stepped closer, brushing her fingers over the covers. They were about pregnancy. She frowned, picking up the top one and flipping through the pages. The images of fetal development, nutritional guidelines, and medical advice stared back at her, a reminder that this wasn't just some distant idea. It was happening, growing, changing inside her every day. Did Nathaniel leave these here? The thought of him, a man who approached life with the precision of a stock portfolio, choosing books on pregnancy, was almost laughable. But at the same time, it made something tighten in her chest. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. Nathaniel, she hesitated before answering. Morning, he said, his voice as composed as ever. Morning, she replied, sitting down on the couch. Did you sleep well? Scarlett huffed a quiet laugh. Why do I feel like you're reading off a script? There was a pause. I'm just checking in. She ran a hand through her hair, glancing back at the books on the table. Did you leave these? Yes. Her fingers traced the edge of one of the pages. Why? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment before answering. Because whether or not you want to admit it, this is new for you. I assumed you'd have questions. Scarlett's stomach twisted. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, but there was something deeper beneath the surface. Right, she said, leaning back against the cushions. Well, thanks, I guess. Did you read any of them? Not yet. You should. Scarlett rolled her eyes. Of course you'd say that. There was a pause, one that stretched just a little too long before Nathaniel exhaled. You can leave if you want, you know. Her breath hitched. What? You don't have to stay at the penthouse all day. If you need to get out, do something. You can. Just let me know where you're going. Scarlett blinked in surprise. She had assumed he wanted her kept here, monitored, controlled. But he was giving her a choice, however small it might be. Why? She asked, unsure if she was challenging him or just trying to understand. Because this is your life too, Scarlett, he said, his voice quieter this time. And I don't want you feeling like a prisoner. She didn't know what to say to that. After they hung up, Scarlett found herself staring at the city beyond the windows, the streets alive with movement, with people who had places to be and lives to live. She had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to just exist. An hour later, she stepped out of the penthouse for the first time since she arrived. The streets were busy, the cold air biting at her skin as she walked with no real destination in mind. She passed coffee shops filled with people on laptops, couples wrapped in scarves, parents pushing strollers. It was strange, realizing how much life had been moving forward while she had been standing still. She ended up at a bookstore. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the familiarity of it, the quiet. Maybe it was the memory of sitting in libraries as a kid, pretending she had somewhere to be when she didn't. She wandered the aisles, running her hands along the spines of books, feeling the weight of stories pressed between pages. She stopped in front of a section she never would have glanced at before. Parenting. She stared at the titles. Books on pregnancy, on motherhood, on raising a child. She told herself she was just looking, that it didn't mean anything, but she picked one up anyway. That evening, she returned to the penthouse with a small paper bag in her hands. She set it down on the kitchen counter and didn't touch it for an hour. But eventually, curiosity won, and she pulled the book out, flipping through the pages as she sat cross-legged on the couch. She told herself it was just research, just something to pass the time. But as she read, as she traced her fingers over diagrams and stories from women who had gone through this before, she realized something she hadn't admitted to herself yet. She was thinking about the baby, not just in the abstract way she had before, not just as a contract or a responsibility she had to fulfill. She was thinking about the baby as hers. Scarlett shut the book quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. No, she couldn't do this. She couldn't get attached. She was supposed to walk away when this was over. She had to. But as she sat there, staring at the open pages in front of her, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure if she could anymore. Scarlett sat on the floor of the penthouse, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the book still open on the coffee table. The words blurred together, the diagrams and medical explanations lost on her as her mind spiraled in 1,000 directions. She had made a mistake, not with the contract, not with the arrangement itself. No, the mistake had come later, when she had let herself feel something. It had started the moment she heard the baby's heartbeat. Before that, it had been easy to pretend that this was nothing more than a deal, a transaction, something separate from herself. But now, the reality of it had settled into her bones. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying her child, and that changed everything. The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed. She ignored it at first, but when it rang again, she forced herself to get up and check the screen. Nathaniel. She hesitated before answering. What? His voice was steady, unaffected. Have dinner with me tonight. Scarlett blinked, caught off guard. What? I assume you still eat dinner, he said dryly. She frowned. Why? A pause. Because it's time we talked. Scarlett exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. Talk about what? Everything's already been decided, hasn't it? Just be ready by 7. He ended the call before she could argue. Scarlett stared at the phone in frustration, then tossed it onto the counter. This wasn't part of the deal. Nathaniel had kept his distance, checking in through short, impersonal phone calls, making sure she went to her appointments, that she followed the routine he had so meticulously planned. But he had never asked to see her. Something had changed. When 7 o'clock came, she found herself seated in the back of Nathaniel's car, her fingers twisting in her lap as the city lights flickered past. The driver pulled up in front of an exclusive restaurant, and before she could fully process what was happening, a valet opened her door. Nathaniel was waiting inside. She spotted him immediately, seated at a private table near the window, dressed in his usual tailored perfection. He looked completely at ease, as if this were just another business meeting. Scarlett slid into the seat across from him, studying his expression carefully. Are we celebrating something? Nathaniel took a sip of his drink. Do you want to celebrate something? She narrowed her eyes. I don't like games. Neither do I. Then what is this? Nathaniel set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. We've been avoiding the obvious, Scarlett. This arrangement doesn't exist in a vacuum. It affects both of us. I think it's time we acknowledge that. Scarlett crossed her arms. And what exactly are we acknowledging? Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, watching her. You tell me. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, and for a moment, Scarlett felt like he was trying to decipher something about her that even she didn't fully understand. She looked away, exhaling through her nose. I don't know what you want from me, Nathaniel. I want to know where your head is, he said simply. Scarlett let out a dry laugh. My head? You mean the part where I remember that I signed a contract agreeing to walk away from my own child? Nathaniel didn't flinch. Yes. The directness of his answer startled her. He wasn't sugarcoating anything. He wasn't pretending this was easy, and somehow that made it worse. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. I don't know, she admitted. Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something she couldn't name. That's not good enough. Scarlett clenched her jaw. Then maybe you should have picked someone else. Maybe, Nathaniel said, his voice unreadable. But I didn't. Scarlett forced herself to hold his gaze, but it was difficult. He saw too much. The waiter arrived, setting down their plates, but Scarlett barely noticed. Her appetite had vanished. She pushed the food around with her fork, her mind racing. Nathaniel's voice broke through the tension. Scarlett! She looked up. I need to know where we stand, he said, his tone quieter this time. Because if you're questioning your ability to go through with this, we need to address it now. Scarlett inhaled sharply, setting her fork down. And what if I'm questioning it? Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice softer than she expected, he said, "Then we figure it out." Scarlett's breath caught. She had expected him to shut her down, to remind her of the contract, to tell her that her emotions had no place in this arrangement. But instead, he had said, we. A lump formed in her throat. "You never planned for this," she whispered. Nathaniel exhaled, rubbing his fingers against his temple. "No, I didn't." Scarlett swallowed, pressing a hand against her stomach, feeling the faintest flutter of something. Not movement, not yet, but a presence, a reminder of what was growing inside her. Nathaniel watched her carefully. "What do you want, Scarlett?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be honest. "I don't know." Nathaniel nodded once, as if that was an acceptable answer. "Then we take it one step at a time." Scarlett wasn't sure why, but the tension in her chest loosened slightly. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff alone. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away. Scarlett had spent years convincing herself that attachment was a weakness, that wanting anything too much only led to disappointment. Life had taught her that people left, that promises broke, that survival depended on not holding on too tightly. And yet, as she lay awake in the vast emptiness of the penthouse, she found herself tracing slow circles over the small curve of her stomach. Her mind consumed by the reality she could no longer ignore. She was attached. She had tried to fight it, to remind herself that this child wasn't hers to keep, that she had entered this arrangement with full knowledge of how it would end. But logic meant nothing when she felt the changes in her body, when she thought about the quiet thump of the heartbeat she had heard for the first time. That moment had cracked something open inside her, something she had spent her whole life keeping locked away. She closed her eyes, pressing her hand more firmly against her stomach, as if she could somehow keep the baby closer, hold on to something that had never truly been hers. But she couldn't. That was the deal. The moment she signed that contract, she had agreed to walk away, and she had no right to change her mind. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, shattering the silence. Nathaniel. She considered ignoring it, letting him wait, but she knew he wasn't the kind of man who liked to be kept waiting. "Yeah?" she answered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Are you awake?" Scarlett let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You just called me. What do you think?" Nathaniel ignored the sarcasm. "I want to see you." Scarlett sat up, frowning. "It's the middle of the night." That didn't sound like a no. She rubbed her forehead, already regretting answering the call. "Nathaniel, what do you want?" A pause. Then, softer than she expected, he said, "Just come downstairs." Scarlett hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. He had never asked to see her, outside of scheduled appointments or formal discussions. His world was built on control, on order, and this was something different. Against her better judgment, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and made her way to the elevator. The doors opened to reveal Nathaniel standing in the dimly lit lounge area, his usual tailored suit traded for something more casual. Dark slacks, a crisp white shirt with the top button undone. He looked different, less like the man who had coldly proposed this arrangement, and more like someone she couldn't quite figure out. Scarlett crossed her arms. "You know, normal people don't schedule meetings at 1 in the morning." Nathaniel's lips twitched. But he didn't smile. This isn't a meeting, she raised an eyebrow. Then what is it? He gestured toward the seating area. Sit with me. Scarlett sighed, but sat across from him, watching as he poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter. I assume you're not trying to get me drunk, she muttered. Nathaniel didn't react. I couldn't sleep. Scarlett tilted her head. And you thought I would be the solution to that problem? He studied her for a moment, then looked down at his glass. You're the only person in my life who doesn't expect something from me. Scarlett blinked, caught off guard by the admission. You think I don't expect anything from you? She asked, her voice quieter now. Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Not in the way everyone else does. Scarlett wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had assumed she was just another deal to him, another transaction to be completed. But now, she wasn't so sure. She glanced down at her stomach, hesitating before speaking again. I don't know if I can do this. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. Do what? Scarlett swallowed hard. Pretend this isn't happening. Act like this is just some business arrangement. I thought I could, but... She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. It's different now. Nathaniel was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. I never wanted complications. Scarlett let out a dry laugh. Yeah, well, welcome to life, Nathaniel. It's messy. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. He looked tired, not in the way someone looks after a long day, but in the way someone looks when they realize they've been wrong about something important. What do you want, Scarlett? He asked. She didn't know how to answer that, because the truth was, she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave anymore. Scarlett had spent years convincing herself that wanting something too much was dangerous. Hope was a trap. The moment you let yourself believe in something better, life found a way to take it from you. That belief had protected her, kept her from breaking when the world had shown her nothing but indifference. But now, sitting across from Nathaniel in the dim glow of the penthouse lounge, she felt something unravel inside her. He had asked her what she wanted, and for the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. She should have said money. That had been the original plan, a clean transaction. She would carry this child, hand it over, and walk away with enough to start over. But the baby had changed things. The steady heartbeat she had heard at the clinic had changed things. And now, the man sitting across from her, so controlled, so calculated, yet undeniably different in this moment, was changing things too. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her stomach, as if she could somehow steady the chaos inside her. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. That's not an answer. Scarlett let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, nothing about this situation has clear answers, does it? Nathaniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his glass, a rare moment of uncertainty flickering across his features. It was strange to see him like this, unsettled. He was a man who planned everything, who left no room for deviation, and yet, here they were, both of them caught in something neither of them had accounted for. Scarlett, he said finally, his voice measured, if you're questioning the arrangement, we need to talk about it now. She knew what he was asking, If she wanted out, if she had changed her mind about giving up the baby, and maybe she had, but she wasn't ready to admit that, not to him, not even to herself. Instead, she turned the question back on him. And what about you? Are you still so sure about all of this? Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. I don't make decisions I'm unsure of. Right, Scarlett said, rolling her eyes, because you're always in control. His jaw tightened slightly. Control is what keeps things from falling apart. Scarlett huffed a quiet laugh. And how's that working out for you? Nathaniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them was enough. For all his control, all his carefully laid plans, there was something about this, about her, about the baby, that he couldn't quite grasp. And maybe that scared him. Scarlett ran a hand over her stomach, fingers grazing the fabric of her sweater. She had spent so much time trying to detach herself from this child, trying to convince herself that she could carry it and let it go without looking back. But every day, that lie became harder to hold on to. You think you can just take this baby and raise it without ever looking back at how it got here? She asked suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. Like it won't matter where they came from. Nathaniel's eyes darkened slightly. That's not what this is, isn't it? His grip on the glass tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he exhaled, rubbing his temple as if trying to ease a headache that had been building for too long. I don't know what you want me to say, Scarlett, he admitted. The honesty in his voice startled her. He had always been so certain, so detached. But now, sitting across from her in the stillness of the night, he looked like a man who had built his entire life on certainty and was just now realizing that some things couldn't be controlled. Scarlett swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I don't either. They sat there in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on them. The contract, the baby, the lines that had once been so clear now blurred beyond recognition. For the first time since this all began, Scarlett wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away, and she had a feeling Nathaniel wasn't sure if he wanted her to. Scarlett had always believed that people like Nathaniel Carter didn't change. Men like him built their lives on control, on structure, on a rigid sense of order that allowed no room for emotions or complications. And yet, as she sat across from him in the penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows between them, she realized she had been wrong. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, not just as the woman carrying his child, not just as the person he had selected to ensure his legacy, but as someone who had disrupted the carefully constructed walls he had spent years building, and maybe, without realizing it, she had let him do the same to her. She wanted to fight it, to remind herself that this was temporary, that she was still just a woman who had signed a contract and nothing more. But the problem was, it wasn't just a contract anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Scarlett exhaled, pressing a hand against her stomach. You never planned for this to be complicated. Nathaniel studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. No. But it is. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He just sat there, watching her, his silence heavier than words. Scarlett swallowed hard. What happens after the baby is born? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, a flicker of something. Uncertainty, hesitation, crossing his face. We follow the agreement. Scarlett forced out a bitter laugh. You say that like it's still that simple. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together. You're the one who wanted clear terms. I was also the one who thought I could do this without getting attached, she shot back. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud. The first time she had let herself acknowledge what had been growing inside her. Not just the baby, but the feelings she had spent months trying to suppress. Nathaniel didn't look surprised. He had always been able to read her too well, even when she wished he couldn't. He exhaled, glancing away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. What do you want, Scarlett? She opened her mouth to answer, but the words caught in her throat. What did she want? Once, the answer had been simple. A way out, a fresh start, the security to never have to worry about where her next meal would come from, to never have to sleep on the streets again. But now, when she thought about walking away, about handing over this child and disappearing, something inside her rebelled. She didn't want to leave. And worse, she didn't want him to want her to leave. Scarlett's fingers curled into fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. You know, for a man who plans everything, you didn't think this through very well. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. Enlighten me. You assumed I'd be able to walk away from this like it was a business deal, she said, her voice quiet but firm, like I'd take the money and forget any of this ever happened. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but his silence was telling. She let out a shaky breath. And maybe I thought I could too. But I can't. And I don't think you can either. For the first time, he looked unsettled. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. Scarlett swallowed hard. I don't know what this means, Nathaniel. I don't even know what I'm asking for. But I know I can't pretend like this hasn't changed things. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Neither can I. The words sent a strange kind of relief through her, but also fear, because if he was admitting that things had changed, it meant they were standing on the edge of something unknown, and Nathaniel Carter did not do unknown. Scarlett shook her head, running a hand through her hair. So what do we do now? Nathaniel studied her, his gaze steady. We figure it out. Scarlett let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since signing that contract, she didn't feel like she was walking this path alone. Scarlett never imagined that the moment she had feared the most would be the one that changed everything. The contractions had started in the early hours of the morning, sharp and unrelenting, pulling her from sleep with a force that left her gasping. She had spent the first hour convincing herself it was nothing, just another discomfort to push through. But by the time she was gripping the edge of the bed, unable to steady her breathing, she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Nathaniel was there before she could even ask for him. She barely remembered calling out, barely remembered the moments between the pain and the rush to the hospital. But she remembered him. The way he moved without hesitation, his hand firm against her back as he guided her into the car, his voice steady even as she clung to him. She had never seen him rattled before, but in those hours leading up to their child's birth, she saw something raw in his eyes. Fear, not the fear of failure, not the fear of losing control, but the fear of losing her. Scarlett had spent her life alone, Even when she had been surrounded by people, she had never felt like she truly belonged anywhere. But when she lay in that hospital bed, exhausted and overwhelmed, and Nathaniel sat beside her, their daughter cradled in his arms, she realized that something had shifted. She had been so sure she would have to let go, that she would be forced to keep her distance, to stay true to the agreement she had signed. But as she watched him, his usually guarded expression softened into something she had never seen before. She knew there was no walking away from this. Their daughter had unraveled them both. Nathaniel looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the dimly lit room. He had always been a man who knew what to say, who spoke with precision and certainty, but now there was no script, no plan. Just him, just her, just the weight of everything unspoken between them. "You don't have to leave," he said quietly. Scarlett swallowed hard, emotion pressing against her ribs. She had expected a fight, had prepared herself for the inevitable conversation where she would have to justify why she couldn't walk away. She had braced for the coldness, the distance, the insistence that things had to remain as they were. But he had already made the decision. She had been waiting for him to ask her to stay, and all this time, he had been waiting for her to believe she could. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she didn't look away. "Are you sure?" Nathaniel exhaled, his thumb brushing absently against their daughter's tiny fingers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Scarlett let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand against her chest as if she could steady the rush of emotions threatening to consume her. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was temporary, that this was never meant to be anything more than a means to an end. But Nathaniel had never seen her that way. Even when she had been nothing but a stranger to him, he had chosen her, not just to carry his child, but to stay. Scarlett shifted, reaching out to trace a light finger against their daughter's cheek, her heart aching at how small she was, how perfect. She wasn't just an agreement, just a decision made out of necessity. She was theirs. She was family. Nathaniel watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to say the words that would make it real. Scarlett inhaled deeply, letting herself feel it. The love, the fear, the terrifying hope that had been creeping in since the moment she first heard the heartbeat that changed everything. "I don't want to go," she whispered. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his grip on their daughter firm but gentle. "Then don't." Scarlett let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Okay," she said. It wasn't just an answer. It was a promise. And for the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Scarlett's journey was never supposed to be about love, belonging, or second chances. It began as a transaction, cold, calculated, and devoid of emotion. She had nothing to lose, and Nathaniel Carter had everything to gain. But as the months passed, as life grew within her, and as the walls between them slowly began to crack, they both realized that what they had entered into was never just a contract. It was something far more powerful. Nathaniel, a man who had spent his entire life believing control was the key to success, was forced to confront the reality that not everything in life can be planned. Scarlett, a woman who had spent years surviving rather than truly living, learned that she was worthy of more than just a means to an end. And in the space between them, where logic should have dictated distance, they found something neither had expected: a family. The moment their daughter was born, the illusion of detachment shattered completely. Scarlett had once believed that she would have to walk away, that this child was never meant to be hers. But in the end, love, real, unplanned, messy love, refused to let her go. And Nathaniel, a man who had once seen his heir as nothing more than a legacy to protect, found himself choosing not just the child, but the mother as well. This story isn't just about an unconventional agreement or two people finding their way to each other despite impossible odds. It's about something deeper: the undeniable truth that life rarely unfolds the way we expect. Sometimes, what begins as necessity turns into something we can't bear to lose. Sometimes, the people we least expect become the ones who change us the most. Scarlett and Nathaniel's story teaches us that control is an illusion. We spend so much of our lives trying to map out the perfect plan, trying to avoid risks, pain, or uncertainty. But in doing so, we often close ourselves off from the things that truly matter. Love, connection, and purpose don't always arrive in ways that make sense. They show up unexpectedly, in the moments we least expect, challenging us to open our hearts to something greater than what we had planned. This story reminds us that change is uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. Nathaniel had to let go of his rigid need for control to truly understand what it meant to love. Scarlett had to let go of her fear of abandonment to finally accept that she was worthy of being chosen. In our own lives, we must ask ourselves, what are we holding on to so tightly that we might be missing something beautiful right in front of us? What fears are keeping us from embracing the love, opportunities, or happiness that life is trying to offer us? The lesson is simple: let go, let life happen. Be open to the unexpected, because sometimes the most unplanned moments bring us the deepest joy. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on love, change, and the unexpected ways life unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that touches hearts, inspires minds, and reminds us all of the beauty in the stories we share. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Let us know in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts.